Nearly 80 meters below the dark surface of the Zambezi River, a submersible is scanning the bedrock. On the surface, engineers are intently watching for radar responses. What they are monitoring isn't a crack in the surface of the wall, but a vast, anomalous void silently excavating. Just above that uncertain void lies the colossal concrete wall of the Kariba Dam, and behind it, 180 billion cubic meters of water await. Millions of people downstream sleep soundly each night, placing their absolute trust in the protection of this engineering marvel. But what is truly happening in the deepest, coldest depths, beneath the claws of a dam, upon which an entire economic system rests? And as usual, we would also like to remind you that all the content in this video has been researched and compiled by our team from multiple sources of information. Therefore, if there are any mistakes or anything that needs correction, we would greatly appreciate it if you could leave a comment below so that we can update and fix it promptly. Thank you, and we hope you enjoy the video. Spanning the turbulent Zambezi River, nestled between the borders of Zambia and Zimbabwe, the Kariba is more than just an inanimate concrete structure. Since its completion in 1959, it has risen to become a symbol of Africa's ultimate engineering power. This colossal structure holds the planet's largest man-made reservoir by volume, Lake Kariba, locking away 180 billion cubic meters. But its true power lies not in holding water, but in what it sustains. The Kariba Dam is the mechanical heart pumping blood to two national economies. Its immense energy powers mines, maintains the rhythm of heavy industrial plants, and ensures a supply of clean water to hospitals and cities stretching from Harare to Lusaka. It doesn't just hold water. It keeps the lights on, the supply chains running smoothly, and a social system functioning. If Kariba were to collapse, the consequences would be far more than a devastating flood. It was a systemic shock, a chain reaction of failures that struck the entire power grid and cut off the lifeline of a vast region. When we think of dam failures, we often picture a giant crack tearing through the concrete surface. But the harsh reality of large-scale infrastructure is that the most deadly threats rarely show up. They begin silently, lurking deep beneath the foundations. In Kariba, the core of the danger lies not in the dam itself, but in the erosion process silently gnawing away at its base. Each time the spillway gates are activated, a massive volume of water plunges down from hundreds of meters, crashing directly into the riverbed. The water is no longer simply a flow. It becomes a giant hydraulic hammer, relentlessly pounding the same spot on the bedrock for over 6 decades. This continuous pounding creates an erosion pool. Initially, this was a phenomenon that had been predicted and calculated in the 1959 design. But nature never conforms to static mathematical models. The real problem arose when this hydraulic hammer refused to stop. It began digging deeper and deeper, far exceeding all anticipated limits. Most frighteningly, the destructive force tearing at the foundation was completely invisible underwater, silently gnawing away at the structure without emitting any warning sound. In technical terms, that dark area is called a plunge pool. Engineers in the 1950s confidently assumed that, over time, this pool would naturally reach equilibrium and stop at a depth of about 30 meters. That was a safe figure, a boundary encoded into the entire load-bearing structure of the dam. But modern survey reports have shattered that confidence. The plunge pool didn't stop at 30 meters. It has been excavated to over 80 meters. This means that a difference of more than 50 meters, the depth of a 15-story building, has been erased from the original bedrock compared to the original design. However, the absolute depth isn't the biggest nightmare. The nature of this invisible enemy lies in its direction of development. The erosive mass isn't just going downwards, but is moving in the opposite direction towards the toe of the dam. For a double-arch dam structure like Kariba, the bedrock and cliffs are not merely auxiliary supports, they are part of the central load-bearing system. If the foundation erodes, the dam will lose its anchor point. That is why a festering wound beneath the dark water is 1,000 times more devastating and unpredictable than any visible crack on the concrete surface. At this point, the truth needs to be clarified. Kariba was not forgotten. Operators, local authorities, and international financiers were fully aware of this fragile boundary. A historic intervention campaign was launched with a budget of $294 million. The mission was clear: reshape the erosion pit to dissipate the kinetic energy of the water and overhaul the entire spillway system. The money was poured in, the machinery was started. But as soon as it reached the riverbed, the project encountered the cold barrier of nature. The geological reality beneath the Zambezi River was far more complex, fragmented, and dilapidated than any projected model. The pit was deeper and wider than predicted, forcing engineers to constantly change the construction plan. The inevitable consequence was a delay in progress, pushing the expected completion date for the erosion pit project all the way to 2028. And this is the core point that creates the breathtaking tension in this story. The greatest fear isn't that people will turn a blind eye. The harsh truth is, even with hundreds of millions of dollars, detailed plans, and the greatest minds, the pace of the human system is still struggling to keep up with an unthinking process of erosion, one that never knows the concept of waiting. Amidst the delays, the authorities remain steadfast in their message. Kariba is under strict supervision and poses no immediate risk of collapse. That's the truth. This scenario isn't meant to declare the dam certain to fail, but we need to break down the technical jargon. Safe is merely a term describing the current operational state. It absolutely does not mean that long-term risks have been eliminated. In fact, over 200 sensitive sensors have been embedded deep within the dam body, measuring water pressure, temperature, and the expansion of each crack day and night. On the surface, the reservoir remains calm, and the city lights shine brightly. But deep within the concrete core, vital data is being scanned hourly. A structure requiring constant monitoring of every beat, like a patient in an intensive care unit, is clearly not a problem-free structure. It is this outward facade of normalcy that makes the inner reality even more terrifying. To understand why that state of safety is so fragile, we must look at the core of Kariba's architecture. This is not a conventional gravity dam, which simply uses massive mass to block water. It is a double curvature arch dam. Imagine the dam as a giant concrete bow stretched taut, resting firmly against the two walls of the Zambezi Gorge. This design leverages the power of geometry to transfer all water pressure to the two rock walls, or abutments. When the bedrock is solid, this arch structure is almost invincible, but its fatal weakness lies in its absolute dependence. If the bedrock beneath is eroded by a plunge pool, cracks, shifts, or weakens more than anticipated, the force distribution within the concrete mass will be forced to redistribute in ways no computer can predict. If just one of the two supporting points of the bow weakens, the entire load-bearing mechanism will collapse. That's why the invisible void at the bottom of the water and the geological structure are never secondary details. They are the heart that determines the life or death boundary of this entire engineering system. History isn't a prophetic judgment, but it's always a cruel reminder. The collapse of an arch design when the foundation shifts isn't just on paper. In 1928, the St. Francis Dam in California crumbled overnight. In 1959, the Malpasset Dam in southern France collapsed, sweeping away everything in its path. Both tragedies claimed hundreds of lives. Their core commonality? Both structures had been technically deemed safe for years, and both were crushed by the same cause: invisible geological defects and the shifting of bedrock beneath the abutments. These events don't mean Kariba will inevitably repeat the same tragedy, but they demonstrate a harsh law of engineering. A monumental structure can appear impenetrable for decades until a small misjudgment of the bedrock accumulates enough strength to become a critical weakness. The hidden foundations beneath the surface are always where the most silent risks rise to deliver fatal blows. If that historical lesson were to repeat itself in the form of a worst-case scenario, the consequences would not stop at the base of the dam. Once released, the massive volume of water would instantly transform a technical malfunction into a transboundary survival crisis. The first place to face destruction would be the town of Kariba, located just a short distance from the dam. Then, a wall of water would sweep through the communities along the Zambezi River in successive layers over time. But the floodwaters don't need passports to cross borders. They would continue straight into Mozambican territory, concentrating all their power on a second deadly bottleneck, the Kariba Dam. In extreme risk assessment models, the immense water pressure from Kariba could completely overwhelm the Kariba's discharge capacity, triggering a double disaster for the entire basin. Further downstream, the densely populated city of Tita and countless agricultural communities lie entirely within the risk zone. Simulation models don't claim 3.5 million lives will be lost, but the data points to a chilling truth. Millions of lives are on the map of potential flooding. Any structural failure at Kariba would plunge that many people into a hopeless race against an unstoppable current. Identifying the danger on paper is not the same as being able to save lives in reality. On technical maps, the flooded area is just a blank expanse of color. But in real life, that expanse of color will sweep across tens of thousands of homes, schools, fishing ports, and rural hospitals. If the sensor network within the Kariba suddenly sends out a life or death signal, a disaster management nightmare will begin. Who will have the authority to trigger the evacuation order? How many precious minutes will it take for the warning to pass through a series of administrative layers before reaching a radio station far downstream? And most importantly, will the telecommunications network, the muddy dirt roads, and the old bridges withstand a panicked exodus of millions? Currently, the three countries sharing this river still lack a coordinated cross-border evacuation plan capable of handling the actual situation. As the countdown to the final hours approaches, those most in need of assistance, the poor, the elderly, children, and those bedridden, are precisely the ones with the least time to make life or death decisions. Kariba, shaped in the mid-20th century, rose to prominence based on the static and predictable climate data of a bygone era. But today, this aging infrastructure is struggling to operate within a completely chaotic hydrological environment. The harshness of the weather doesn't directly break the foundations, but it strips away the security of calculated limits. Periodic droughts relentlessly stifle reservoirs, crippling hydropower output and placing immense pressure on the economy. Conversely, erratic storms carrying explosive water flows can strike at any moment, paralyzing the operation of spillways and erosion pits awaiting repair. Kariba is now more than just a story of the African continent. It has become a haunting global symbol, humanity struggling to use yesterday's fragile infrastructure to withstand tomorrow's unpredictable fury of nature. Right now, the Kariba Dam hasn't broken. It would be a misjudgment to claim a catastrophe is certain to strike tomorrow. It's quite possible this colossal concrete structure will remain standing across the Zambezi Gorge for many years to come. But with a constantly deepening plunge pool, a complex geological foundation, a perpetually delayed restoration project, and the lives of millions hanging in the balance downstream, this is a systemic fault line demanding an absolute wake-up call. The battle at Kariba is now an incredibly harsh one. On one side is human effort, engineers, hundreds of sensors, international funding, plans, and projected completion milestones. On the other is the primal force of nature, billions of tons of water, hydraulic pressure, fractured rock, and time. The final question remains unanswered. Can humanity repair this wound in time before the erosion process goes too far? Because at a depth of 80 meters beneath that still water, the destruction never ceases for a second. Nature has its own cruel rules. Water doesn't read contracts. It doesn't negotiate budgets. It never waits for a schedule to be completed. It simply waits patiently for enough time.